welcome to Red Red. Today I want to talk about Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio. This was a sort of 17th century collection of creepy short stories written by Paul Songling, and this edition is translated by John Minford, who is a current living translator and sinologist, I suppose. This edition is technically abridged because the complete Strange Tales is something like 503 stories, and this collection contains 104 stories. They're all really great, and they're just kind of brilliant short stories that have to do with supernatural encounters with fox spirits, ghosts, demons, kings from the underworld, etc. A couple of quick background things. As I usually do with short stories or very short stories, I actually didn't kind of note any particular prose things. I just highlighted full short stories that I want to go back and reread, and in this video I'm actually going to read 2 short stories in full because they're quite short, and I just want to give you an idea or a taste of what the short stories are like and why I think they're really worth your time. A little bit of background with the author, Paul. So there's some urban legends or some tales, maybe apocryphal, that he would allegedly kind of set up on the side of the road and offer people like tea and snacks or whatever in order to exchange stories. He was kind of eternally looking for anecdotes that he could work into and talk about and create into these strange tales. Because of the fact that some of the stories are critiquing or satirizing parts of Chinese government at the time and like the kind of bureaucratic nature of it, some of the stories actually come across as Kafkaesque, and it's really cool. One of the stories that I'm going to read kind of has that particular vibe. The idea, generally the stories kind of fall into either a tragedy or a comedy. The stories range from being about half a page long to maybe at most 10 pages. And another thing that's really cool is almost every story is accompanied with an illustration, which is almost worth buying the collection. They're worth buying the collection just on their own. With the tragedy and comedy, tragic stories usually have a ghost or a fox spirit that comes and torments either one main character or a small group of main characters. And kind of odd or quirky supernatural encounter that is only witnessed by one person and it never happens again, and it kind of just it's like this peek or this glimpse into the netherworld. And there's actually a really cool, like, some of the stories are actually genuinely scary. Like, there's a story early on, I'm trying to remember what it was called, but basically these 4 travelers are, they're going and they go to a tavern and they're like, dude, we really need a place to stay tonight. And the innkeeper's like, sorry, mate's got nothing for you. And they're like, no, we're really desperate. We need somewhere to stay. And the innkeeper says, well, I've got one room, but you're not going to like it because my daughter just died in that room. And they're like, what the fuck? But they agree to stay in there, and so it's like a dark room. They just go in, the 4 of them go, they fall asleep. There's the woman's corpse just sort of there, and then when they're the main character, he's like a little bit too scared to go to sleep, so he's kind of got the blankets up and he's covering his face, and then he hears that the woman's body like gets up and starts walking over to everybody, and she starts like breathing on them, and he's just like, he has a couple of attempts to try and escape, but it's almost like a horror video game where like the exclamation mark on top of her head just goes boing, and he like hides and then ducks, and then he kind of runs out, and she chases after him. So there's this like ghost chasing him through the town, and then he stops at these monks, and these monks are just like, dude, you're on your own. And he's just like, oh shit, and he keeps running, and he does like a footy dive behind a poplar tree, and then the woman ghost like jumps at him but ends up hugging the tree, and she gets like stuck in this tree. And then in the morning when they look at her, her fingers have like bored their way into the tree trunk, like, you know, I don't know, longer than the length of fingers, I suppose. And then they kind of peel her off and look at her dead corpse. And then they find out that the three others that she breathed on are dead. And then this is where the almost Kafka thing comes in, where he's like, I'm the only one who witnessed this. I went and I was traveling with these four people. When I go back home, they're all going to think that I killed them. And the local magistrate was like, oh, don't worry, I'll just sign a piece of paper to let you know that I attest to your story, that it was a supernatural encounter. You can go on your way. And then he moseys on off, and that's the end of the story. Yeah, so that's just a kind of taste. I will read, rather than my kind of slang Aussie bogan paraphrase of a story, I will actually read the story. Read a couple of stories. But last few things that I have, I think some of the surreal imagery, even though these stories have been the inspiration or the template for some Chinese films, I think that they're actually really the sort of things that modern filmmakers like A24 films and the kind of things that you see in like Hereditary or The Green Knight, a lot of that imagery, even though part of it is inspired by or you can see the inspiration from things like Fraser's Golden Bow. There's a lot of really cool images in here that I think modern creatives can kind of read and get some inspiration from. Like there's one story where there's a kind of hut that is revealed to be the waiting room for death, and then there's another story where this guy has like his eyes covered and he's completely blind, but then it turns out that there's actually people who are living in his eyes, and one of them moves over to the other eye to be a companion with the other thing, and then his right eye is opened and now he can see further with one eye than he could with two, and they're really cool things. Just checking my notes again, I think that Ryunosuke Akutagawa was undoubtedly inspired by this collection. Just so many of the things like Akutagawa's story, of course Kappa, his kind of novella, but also stories like the Hell Screen. It kind of reminded me a little bit, it's a more tragic spin on a story in this collection called The Painted Wall, where this monk goes into a painting and kind of lives with this concubine. I just feel like Akutagawa's sentiments and the way that he sort of wrote fables, I'm sure he was inspired by this. Getting back onto the monk going in with the concubine, every person in this story is egregiously horny, and there's even like kind of notes or comments from Chinese commentators saying, why is it that every single time a man even remotely glimpses a woman, she is A, stunning and beautiful, and B, they want to have sex immediately? A lot of the time it is because the woman is actually like a fox spirit or a ghost, and so she is willing or consenting to it, but that doesn't really explain why the men are, so licentious. But and like some of the commentators said that it was probably just because of the kind of oppressive regimes of the time that was just making men, because there was such a strict process, it was making men so excessively focused on banging. And so more things, I really liked that the way to describe, so ghosts are almost always tragic characters. They're obviously characters who have died, and so their souls are like stuck in this realm, and sometimes they're malicious and they're preying on people. Sometimes they just want a chance to, have a go and do it again. Fox spirits, on the other hand, are interesting. Most of the time they're malicious. Sometimes they're benign, but they occupy this weird kind of in-between zone where they're more like magicians, and they can kind of conjure spells. It's almost like they're in this sort of trickster area, like somewhere between an angel or a demon, and that's really cool. It's cool to see, like, they can shapeshift, obviously, but they have access to godlike knowledge and rituals for immortality and things like that, and it's actually made me even more appreciate, I can't remember the name of the exact story, But they made an episode of Love, Death and Robots about it. But Ken Liu wrote a story that featured like a fox spirit, and he kind of worked it in to be a commentary or talking about the magic leaving after industrialization. And after reading this collection and sort of seeing firsthand some of the fox spirit stories and legends, it made me appreciate that story a little bit more. I also just want to mention out of context that there is a story in this collection called Duck Justice, which I think is hilarious. And I think at this point, I'm pretty much just going to jump in and start reading a couple of extracts. The first one that I want to read is in this collection. It's on page 87, and it is a story called A Most Exemplary Monk. A man named Zhang died suddenly and was escorted at once by evil attendants into the presence of Yama, king of the underworld. Yama checked his registers and turned angrily to the attendants, informing them that they had brought the wrong man and were to take him back immediately. As they left, Zhang secretly entreated his devil guards to let him have a quick look at hell, and they led him all the way through the 9 dark places, past the mountain of knives and the forest of swords, pointing out the various sights one by one. Reminding me, by the way, that's makes me think of Akutagawa's story, The Spider's Thread. Anyway, jumping back in. By and by, they reached a place where a Buddhist monk was hanging upside down in the air, suspended by a rope through a hole in his leg. He was crying out in excruciating pain. As Zhang approached, he saw to his great horror and distress that the man was his own brother. He asked his guards for the reason for this appalling punishment, and they informed him that the monk had been condemned to this torment for having collected alms on behalf of his order, which he then squandered on gambling and debauchery. Nor, they added, will his punishment cease until he repents his misdeeds. When Zhang regained consciousness, fearing that his brother must already be dead, he hurried off to the Xingfu monastery, where he had been in residence. As he went in at the door, he heard a loud shrieking, and, on proceeding to his brother's cell, found him upside down, just as he had seen him in hell, with his legs tied up above him to the wall and an abscess oozing blood and pus between his thighs. Appalled, he asked him for an explanation, and his brother told him that he was in terrible pain and that this was the only position in which the pain was at all bearable. Zhang now described what he had seen in hell, and the monk was so terrified that he at once gave up drinking liquor and eating meat, and devoted himself humbly to the recitation of the sutras and mantras of his religion. In a fortnight he was well again, and became known ever afterwards as a most exemplary monk. And here's another one. This story is only about half a page long, but it's interesting because it almost, in a really absurd way, critiques or points attention to the kind of abuse of adopting child brides, and makes it in this weird, almost like when a satire kind of stuns you by looking at a tragic thing and then pointing out almost like such a trivial or absurd part or component of it that it almost lets you stew on and digest the actual tragic thing. And I'll read it. So this is called Thumb and Thimble. In the region of Zhending country, there lived an orphan girl who at the age of 6 or 7 was adopted into another family as a child bride. She had lived with them a year or two when her husband tricked her into having sexual relations with him and made her pregnant. Her stomach swelled up, and thinking she must be ill, she went to see her foster mother. "Does it move?" the woman asked. "It does," was the girl's honest reply. The foster mother was greatly astonished, but considering how young the girl was, she was loth to jump to conclusions or pass judgment. Not long afterwards, the girl gave birth to a boy. "Well, I never," sighed the foster mother. "A thumb-sized mother has brought a thimble-sized baby into the world." And so just now thinking about that, I'm like, is it some more grand critique of kind of adopting a project too early and then creating negligible outcomes or something like that? And it almost uses the kind of obvious abuse of like children and child brides as a way to make you think about that. But then you also think, well, maybe am I trivializing the child bride concubinage because I'm automatically thinking of it as a kind of allegory for something else. Really interesting, and there's a lot of stories like that that show up throughout this collection. Something I thought was kind of funny as well, just an anecdote that I wanted to mention before we finish up, is that one of the original big translations of this was actually done by Giles, who is the second half of the Wade Giles Chinese romanization system. And the funny thing is that when Giles translated it, maybe because of his personal sentiments, or maybe because he was working within like a Victorian era morality, apparently his explanation or his translation was so prudish that he cut out or removed or censored anything relating to sex, blood, violence, abuse, etc., to the point where apparently when you read stories, the fox spirits show up and want to just like have tea and have a conversation with the main characters rather than wanting to immediately have sex with them. And it's just hilarious having read that anecdote after having actually read the stories, because it's like the equivalent of, I suppose, being given reading the Brothers Grimm and then finding out that most people have been reading fairy tales all this whole time. So yeah, it's kind of funny. I highly recommend giving this collection a go. Thank you again for watching. For anyone who's hung out to the end, by the way, a quick fun book haul. Now that I kind of live near the city, I went and checked out a bookstore called Tidal Bookshop in Sydney, in Barangaroo, and somehow, miraculously, they had this, a biography of Cervantes, which I looked up online and is quite exceptionally rare. And so yeah, shout out to Tidal Bookstore for having this awesome book. One day I'll get into it. I'm still really looking out. I want to try and find Cervantes's novellas, the 10 exemplary tales or something like that. But yeah, thanks again for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for the next one. I don't know why I've said that. I've never said that. I always say I'll see you in the next one.